A preliminary proxy statement is a draft of the proxy that is filed with the SEC in certain specified circumstances as required by an SEC rule before the final, also known as the definitive version of that proxy is filed today on ZippyPoint. I'm Brock Romanek. I'm a big fan of use. So here's something that can be called a niche area that you'll bump up against every so often if you deal with proxies on the regular basis. The need to file a preliminary version of the proxy with the SEC before you can file the final definitive version and then start delivering it, start mailing it, start posting it. This is a really important area to know because it can really screw up your timing of when you're allowed to deliver your proxy to shareholders, which in turn impacts the date of your annual meeting. Rule 14a-6a is worded so that all proxies are required to be filed in preliminary form unless the matters on your ballot fall within the 8 carve-outs listed in the regulation. As it happens, the carve-outs include many of the items that typically are on a ballot: director elections, ratification or approval of auditors, shareholder proposals, say on pay, say on frequency, and approval of equity compensation plans, except for specific awards and perhaps an increase in shares under a plan. Then beyond these 8 carve-outs, the CorpFin staff has issued a few interpretations to create carve-outs beyond the regulation. That said, there are plenty of circumstances that do trigger the need to file a proxy in preliminary form: charter amendments, an increase in authorized shares, specific awards under an equity plan, changing the company's name. See my separate vid guide about all you need to do with the SEC when you change a company's name, and proxy contests. Here are 5 mistakes related to preliminary proxies that are sometimes made. 1, forgetting CorpFin may delay a proxy for weeks. 2, filing a revised preliminary for material changes. 3, filing for shareholder proposals. 4, leaving too much blank. 5, forgetting to file a proxy card. 1, forgetting CorpFin may delay a proxy for weeks. So Rule 14a-6a states that a preliminary proxy must be filed at least 10 calendar days prior to the filing of the definitive proxy. The purpose of this 10-day period is to give the CorpFin staff a chance to screen the preliminary proxy and determine if it's going to pull it for a review, if it's going to review your filing. If the filing is indeed pulled for review, the staff will likely issue written comments in the form of a comment letter that will result in some back and forth between your company and the SEC staff. This takes time and can really screw up a tight timeline, which inevitably you're going to have. There's always a tight timeline in the proxy season to get your proxies delivered timely before the annual shareholder meeting is held. Not all preliminary proxies are selected for review, but they almost always are for proxy contests or a deal to go private. So let's talk about that 10-day window. The date of the filing of the preliminary proxy with the SEC is considered day 1. If the end of the 10-day review period expires on a weekend or on a holiday, then the company can file the definitive proxy as soon as EDGAR opens for the week. So if you file on a Friday, 2 weekends will fall into your 10-day waiting period. Now you can call down to the CorpFin staff to request early termination of this 10-day period if you're really in a bind. I'm really in a bind here. Have your persuasive arguments ready. Tight timelines, tight deadlines may be enough. The good news is if you call down to the staff and they tell you it won't be reviewed, you're good to go. You can file your definitive proxy and deliver. If you file a preliminary proxy and you have not heard from the staff within that 10 calendar day period from the date of your filing, you are free to print and mail at that point. You don't have to call down to the CorpFin staff to confirm that you're clear. It's sort of a strange process that you're clear if you don't hear anything from the staff, but that's the way it is. Some people still call down to the SEC staff even though they don't need to. Some folks just like to be sure. If you do call the SEC, instead of telling you that they're not going to review your proxy, they almost always say, if you don't hear from us in 10 days, you are free to print and mail. It's not a whole lot of help. So you're not likely to hear some golden words from a SEC staffer, even though the language in Rule 14a-6a states, or such shorter period upon a showing of good cause. That gives the staff some leeway into cutting you loose early. Here's the bummer. If your preliminary proxy is picked for review, your timeline for printing and mailing a proxy can be affected in a big way. A CorpFin review can last anywhere from 10 days to several weeks. So you really need to assume it's selected for review, picked for review, and build that into your time and responsibility schedule in advance. You may need to file a revised preliminary proxy to clear comments from the staff before you even file your definitive, depending on the severity of the staff's comments. The staff will guide you here. You don't have to guess about how severe their comments are. They're going to let you know if you need to file a revised proxy or if the comments are of a future nature to do it next year. If you do file a revised proxy, provide a redline version to the staff to facilitate the review and get clearance as soon as possible. Although the proxy rules don't require the staff to officially approve or clear their preliminary proxy, you want to wait to file a definitive proxy until the staff has indicated that it has no more comments. Some staffers take it quite personally if a company files the definitive before the preliminary is clear. I know someone did that to me one time when I was on the staff, and I wish I still remembered their name, but I don't. But I do remember their law firm name, and that firm went out of business long ago. The upshot here is that if you know that your annual meeting agenda, your ballot will include one or more items that trigger the need to file a preliminary proxy, you really do need to adjust your time and responsibility schedule so that you file the preliminary proxy weeks before you intend to deliver your proxy to shareholders. Note 2 to Rule 14.6a urges you to file the proxy on the earliest practicable date. Take them up on that advice. Of course, this is easier said than done for sure because there often isn't that type of wiggle room in your schedule, but you got to do what you got to do. 2, filing a revised preliminary for immaterial changes. So note 1 to Rule 14a(6)a requires companies filing a revised preliminary proxy to note that there's a new 10-day waiting period. It re-triggers a 10-day waiting period. If the revised filing contains material revisions or a material new proposal that constitutes a fundamental change. These are terms for which there is not much SEC staff guidance. It's a facts and circumstances determination. Calling the staff to ask if revisions are material or if your new proposal is a fundamental change is a waste of time. They don't weigh in on that kind of thing. You know your circumstances better than they do, and they don't want to take a risk trying to guess what you're doing. If the revised preliminary proxy contains an additional proposal that would not on its own have required a preliminary filing, like an amendment to an equity compensation plan, there's a good argument that it's not a fundamental change. Sometimes companies file a preliminary proxy due to Proposal A, but before the definitive proxy is filed, then they decide to take action on a matter unrelated to Proposal A that results in changing the disclosure elsewhere in the proxy. Some companies decide to make this update in the definitive proxy and they don't file revised preliminary materials. They want to avoid resetting the 10-day clock. And they do this under the argument that the presence of the new information doesn't trigger a requirement to file a preliminary proxy. Since the CorpFin staff has broad discretion to decide what it wants to review and comment upon once it selects a preliminary proxy for review, it can be dicey to think that you can assume that the information you change or add isn't going to be relevant to the staff just because that information doesn't have anything to do with the proposal that triggered the preliminary filing in the first place. But I do think this happens more often than not in practice because time is almost always tight and you don't have an extra 10 days to spare. That's the risk you take with angering the SEC staff. 3, filing for shareholder proposals. So Rule 14a(6)(a)(3) states that a preliminary proxy is not required due to the inclusion of a Rule 14a(8) shareholder proposal in the proxy. It's one of the carve-outs. This is true even if the shareholder proposal is asking the company to declassify the board, which would require an amendment of the company's articles of the company's charter to effectuate, since the declassification proposal is merely precatory, it's advisory. But if the company includes its own declassification proposal on the ballot on the annual meeting agenda, it's a management proposal, not a shareholder proposal, even if it's worded the exact same way that a shareholder proposal does that it had received. It would no longer be carved out and triggers a preliminary proxy requirement. 4, leaving too much blank. So back in my law firm days, an associate left so much of a preliminary proxy statement blank that it got kicked back from the staff, saying the staff said it was so incomplete that it could not be considered a legitimate filing. This is very rare. the only time I've seen it, that the staff makes that kind of ruling. Well, I think I saw it a couple other times, but it's rare. And the associate in my firm got in big trouble, as he should have been. Although preliminary proxies are supposed to be preliminary and not final, the SEC staff will not consider them to be complete and decide whether to review it unless nearly all of the required content is included in the preliminary proxy, even though it's sort of a draft. The SEC staff will tolerate only a few missing blanks: the date of the proxy statement, you don't know that yet, and perhaps the number of holders as of the record date. That's it. Everything else should be completed. So it might not be quite final on your end. Maybe you have a few minor tweaks to make here and there, but it should be pretty close to final, and definitely look final to the SEC when you file it in preliminary form. Remember that when you file a preliminary proxy, it's a publicly available document. It's filed on Edgar, and the world can see it. The world can review it. It shows up in your filing stream on Edgar as a pre-14A, and the final proxy, the definitive proxy, will show up as a def 14A. So here's an example of what one looks like. The cover page for Schedule 14A has a box near the top checked indicating it's a preliminary proxy. And then if you go on to the next page, you see that it says it's a preliminary proxy subject to completion. Otherwise, there is nothing else in the proxy that would let the reader know that whether it's a definitive proxy or a preliminary proxy. These are the only two differences. 5, forgetting to file a proxy card. This is a common mistake. A common mistake, forgetting to file a proxy card with the preliminary proxy. It's easy enough to forget filing your proxy card with the definitive proxy, your final proxy as it is, but it's doubly easy to forget when you're filing the proxy in its preliminary form. It's often forgotten to file the proxy card. Rule 14A-6A requires the filing of both the proxy statement and the form of proxy, the proxy card, in preliminary form. On the other hand, you don't have to file a preliminary notice of internet availability of proxy materials as additional soliciting materials or as part of the preliminary proxy, because the e-proxy rule, the notice and access rule, Rule 14A-16, is triggered by the distribution of proxy materials. Bear in mind, though, you still do have to file this notice of internet availability as additional soliciting materials before you file the definitive proxy. That's the way the timing works, so that you can deliver the final proxy to shareholders. And I have a separate vid guide about the entire timeline of the proxy season, some great panelists, a link to which is below. And then let's talk about including a cover letter to the SEC staff. This is not really a mistake, so I didn't count it towards my list of 5. It's more of a wasted time. When you're filing a preliminary proxy on Edgar, some people do include a cover letter to the SEC staff. They do this to argue that the ballot doesn't include anything that should trigger a review, that this preliminary proxy shouldn't be selected for review, even though there's something on the ballot that triggered the need to file the preliminary proxy in the first place. Don't bother with this cover letter. It really won't help the CorpFin staff to decide whether to select the filing for review. They do their own independent analysis. They're not going to be persuaded one way or another by your cover letter. They ain't going to read it. Funny enough, Note 4 to Rule 14A-6A includes a reference to a cover letter for when a preliminary proxy is filed, because it mentions an ongoing proxy contest. Proxy contests are truly a different beast, and this note is in the rule to help flag the fact that this is one for the staff, a proxy contest. So you do use cover letters for proxy contests, and quite often these filings will be pulled for a review by the CorpFin staff. Proxy contests are solicitations in opposition as defined in Note 3. Anyways, let me know what you think.